In the hush of twilight in colonial America, a warm glow flickers from the hearth of a humble log homestead. The last light of day fades over endless forests and quiet village lanes. A soft wind stirs the tall pines and oaks, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and the earthy scent of tilled fields. Crickets chirp in the meadows, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howls beneath a canopy of brilliant stars. In this tranquil hour, the many worlds of colonial America come alive in memory. We embark on a slow, gentle journey into the daily lives of those who lived in the American colonies, long before the modern United States. A journey meant to soothe and calm, as much as to inform. This will not be a hurried march through battles or political events, but a meditative wander across time, exploring how ordinary people worked, worshipped, ate, slept, and built their communities on a new continent. Imagine lantern light glimmering through the small windows of a colonial farmhouse, and the muffled sound of a family's evening prayers within. Envision the narrow dirt streets of a New England village at dusk, empty and peaceful after the day's bustle, or the broad porch of a southern plantation house where a planter quietly sips tea as night falls, listening to the distant chorus of frogs by the riverbank. In the port city, see the harbor waters turning silvery under the moon as ships' masts gently sway. A watchman's lantern casts dancing shadows on brick walls as he calls out the hour. Across the inland frontier, a solitary cabin stands under towering dark trees, its inhabitants gazing at the Milky Way in the crystal-clear night sky. The surrounding wilderness both a comfort and a mystery. And beyond the colonial settlements, in the forest clearing of an indigenous American village, a council fire burns low and bright. Elders and families gathered to share food and stories, giving thanks to the spirits of the land. These parallel scenes coexisted in the vast tapestry of colonial America, each thread a different people's experience, yet all part of the fabric of everyday life in the 17th and 18th centuries. Over the next several chapters, we will gently explore this tapestry in all its variety. We will walk through the seasons and landscapes of the 13 British colonies that took root along the Atlantic coast. From the rocky shores of New England to the fertile fields of the South, and even venture to the frontiers and beyond the colonial borders. We will hear of English Puritans and Virginia planters, of German farmers in Pennsylvania and Dutch traders in New York, of Quaker craftsmen and enslaved African laborers, of indigenous families who witnessed newcomers transform their lands. In each chapter, we will focus on the rhythms of daily life, the tasks that filled each morning and afternoon, the foods on their tables, the homes that sheltered them, the beliefs that guided them, and the communities they built. Together, we will also illuminate contrasting experiences, the sharp differences between the lives of the wealthy and the poor, between men and women, between free citizens, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, and native peoples. All these voices together tell the true story of how people actually lived in colonial America, in both hardship and hope. The tone of our journey will remain soft and unhurried. Like leaves drifting down a gentle stream, we will let the details of daily existence carry us quietly along. We may pause to listen to a mother singing a lullaby to her child by candlelight, or to watch a farmer at dawn as he walks behind his plow horse in a dewy field. We may linger in the doorway of a village schoolhouse where children recite their letters, or sit under the shade of an old oak to overhear neighbors swapping news after church on Sunday. Through these small, intimate moments, history will unfold in a calm, reassuring manner. If the outside world presses on your mind, allow it to fade. Let the scenes of a bygone era replace it, as comforting as the warm glow from a colonial fireplace on a winter's night. Our story begins at the first light of a new era, the early 1600s, when European settlers established tenuous toeholds on the edge of a vast, unfamiliar continent. Before the grand cities and established colonies, there were fragile wooden forts and hopeful encampments teetering between survival and failure. In these first colonial dawns, life was harsh, simple, and uncertain. Yet even then, in the most trying conditions, people found moments of peace and routine. A quiet prayer at sunrise, or the simple pleasure of sharing a warm meal by a crackling fire after a day of toil. Let us step into that time now, as the first colonists awaken in a strange new land, determined to build a life here in the wilds of America. With the dim glow of dawn breaking over the Atlantic, Chapter 2 awaits, and with it, the dawn of colonial life itself. Chapter 2. First Footsteps. Early colonial dawn. The year is 1620, and a pale autumn sun is rising over the coastal woodlands of what will one day be called New England. A small settlement of rough timber dwellings stands near the shore, surrounded by tall stands of pine and oak. This is Plymouth Plantation. Plymouth, a fledgling colony of English pilgrims seeking a new life of religious freedom. In the gray light of early morning, thin tendrils of smoke begin to curl from the chimney of a common house. Inside the simple one-room structure, a woman in a homespun wool gown stirs a pot of porridge over the hearth. The rich smell of boiling cornmeal mingles with the salty tang of sea air seeping through the chinks in the log walls. One by one, her children awaken on straw-filled mattresses laid on the floor. They shiver in the chill and pull threadbare blankets around their small shoulders. The mother ladles warm mush into wooden bowls, and the family murmurs a quiet blessing of thanks. They eat by the faint light of dawn and glowing embers, each spoonful a small comfort against the knowledge that food is rationed carefully, the memory of last winter's hunger still fresh. Outside, the settlement is still and silent. The crude shelters are huddled together for protection, their thatched roofs wet with dew. Beyond them, the forest looms, beautiful but forbidding. A few colonists emerge into the crisp air, their breath visible in wispy clouds. Among them is a man who was a carpenter back in England. He picks up an axe and walks toward the trees to chop firewood. Another is a former farmer. He heads to a small clearing where the colony's precious store of maize, corn, is growing. That corn, a new crop to these Englishmen, has been their salvation, taught to them by the local Wampanoag people. One of the Wampanoag, an interpreter named Tisquantum, or Squanto, had shown the newcomers how to plant corn kernels with fish heads as fertilizer to enrich the soil. Thanks to this indigenous wisdom, the autumn harvest was good. Now the settlers carefully tend the cornfields, knowing their survival through the coming winter depends on these golden grains. In the distance, a few native Wampanoag observers watch the village calmly from behind the tree line, curious and wary. For thousands of years their ancestors have lived on this land, fishing in the clear rivers and hunting in these woods. To them, the little English colony is a new and strange presence. But for now, there is an uneasy peace. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag have a formal agreement of mutual protection, and even celebrated a 3-day harvest feast together in this very autumn of 1621, a gathering later remembered as the First Thanksgiving. At that celebration, English and Wampanoag men, women, and children mingled cautiously, sharing venison, wild fowl, corn, and shellfish, and offering prayers of thanks. For a brief moment, two worlds joined in harmony. The early years of colonial life were often a mix of hope and desperate struggle. As the sun climbs higher, illuminating the bay beyond Plymouth with a soft golden light, we shift our view to another scene farther south along the coast. It is the year 1609, on a swampy peninsula in Virginia, at the colony of Jamestown. Here, the dawn finds a very different mood. The settlement is a triangular wooden fort by the James River, housing English adventurers and indentured servants who arrived seeking fortune. But instead of riches, they have found disease and hunger. Inside the fort's log palisade, dozens of gaunt survivors stir from their cramped barracks. The air is heavy with humidity even at dawn, and mosquitoes buzz incessantly. A man coughs weakly. Malnutrition has left him feverish. In the muddy yard, a small group gathers around a blackened iron pot hanging over coals, brewing a thin barley soup, one of the few foods left. This time would later be known as the starving time in Jamestown. Many did not live through that winter. Some colonists, driven mad by hunger, scavenged for acorns and even resorted to eating shoe leather. But on this morning, they sip the hot broth slowly, trying to summon the strength for another day. A lean figure of authority, Captain John Smith, limps across the compound, urging the men to fortify defenses and tend to the sick. He remembers how the local Powhatan Indians had sometimes brought corn to trade, which kept the colony alive. Relations with the Powhatan have seesawed between cautious trade and violent conflict. John Smith himself famously had a dramatic encounter with Chief Powhatan's young daughter, Pocahontas. She once placed herself between Smith and her father's warriors to save his life, according to Smith's later account. Whether legend or truth, it symbolizes how indigenous generosity and knowledge were pivotal for colonists' survival at times. As the hazy sun beats down on the tobacco fields just outside the fort, a few settlers trudge out to tend the young plants. Tobacco has become Jamestown's lifeline, and the reason it will soon prosper. In a few years, the colony will be sending shiploads of cured tobacco leaf back to England for hefty profit, transforming this struggling outpost into a boomtown. But on this early morning in 1609, such a future is barely imaginable. The inhabitants are focused simply on making it to nightfall alive. Despite the grim realities, life in these nascent colonies still had to go on from day to day. The early colonists tried to recreate some of the normalcy of the homes they left behind. In Jamestown, an Anglican church service is held each Sunday under an open-air awning, where the settlers dutifully gather to listen to sermons and sing psalms. In Plymouth, the Pilgrims observe the Sabbath strictly. No work or travel, only worship and rest. On this quiet Sunday morning in Plymouth, we can imagine the villagers filing into their crude meeting house, men carrying muskets as a precaution, women in plain, bonnets and children fidgeting quietly. They sit on hard benches as the Reverend reads from the Bible and preaches for hours. Outside, the New England landscape is ablaze with autumn color, crimson and gold leaves falling gently as the sounds of English hymns mingle with the distant cry of a loon on the bay. For those weary settlers, faith is both a comfort and a compass, helping them endure the immense uncertainties of the New World. In these early colonies, every person's labor was needed to build a foothold. There was little room for idleness. Even children once past toddler age had tasks to do. A 7-year-old boy in Jamestown might fetch water from the river, keeping a wary eye out for alligators or hostile arrows, or help sweep out a storehouse. A young girl in Plymouth might gather kindling for the fire, or pluck feathers from wildfowl for the evening stew. Women's lives revolved around managing scarce provisions and constant hard work, cooking, mending, washing clothes by hand, and nursing the ill. Men spent their days building shelters, standing guard, hunting game, and later, planting and harvesting cash crops like tobacco or corn. Social class distinctions from Europe initially fell away in these desperate circumstances. Gentlemen who arrived expecting leisure found themselves thatching roofs or chopping wood alongside common laborers simply to survive. Yet, not all labor was equal or free. As early as 1619, a Dutch ship brought the first enslaved Africans to Virginia. Their arrival marked the beginning of a dark institution on American soil. Those first African captives were put to work in Jamestown's tobacco fields. At the same time, thousands of poorer Europeans came over as indentured servants, men and women who traded 4 to 7 years of work for passage to America. By some estimates, half or more of all European immigrants in the 1600s arrived under such servitude. Their lives were harsh. They labored long hours for masters, often facing abuse, and many died before earning freedom. In these early chapters of colonial history, the seeds of a stratified society were sown even as colonists struggled together to establish their communities. As the sun reaches its zenith on our imagined day in early colonial America, we can picture the inhabitants of Plymouth and Jamestown pausing in their work to take a meager midday meal. In Plymouth, dinner, the term for the noon meal, might consist of coarse bread made from cornmeal, maybe a bit of goat cheese, and whatever vegetables are in season, perhaps boiled pumpkin or dried peas. In Jamestown, a fortunate laborer might eat some salted fish or smoked meat with bread, but many have only thin gruel. They have learned to incorporate native foods like corn, squash, and beans into their diet, foods unknown in Europe, but vital here. The Native Americans' 3 sisters, those 3 crops grown together, have proven a godsend. Some colonists have even acquired a taste for roasted pumpkin and cornbread. On better days, wild game or waterfowl supplements the menu. On poor days, they tighten their belts and drink water when it's clean, or small beer. Yet even at these humble meals, there can be moments of contentment. Perhaps a father in Plymouth shares a humorous story from back in England, making his family chuckle and momentarily forget their worries. Or a group of Jamestown settlers, eating in weary silence, take a moment to be thankful that at least this day they have something warm to fill their stomachs. With the noon past, the colonists return to their labors. There are fortifications to mend, wells to dig, fields to tend, and roofs to repair before winter. The work is unending, but in work there is purpose. For all the adversity, these early European settlers possess an undeniable resolve. They left their old world believing in the possibility of a new life, and they cling to that belief fiercely. In the evenings, after darkness falls and the day's chores are finally done, a calm descends on the small communities. In Plymouth, families gather around hearths that glow with orange warmth. A father might pull out a precious Bible or prayer book and lead his household in evening devotions. A mother, darning a sock by firelight, listens to the wind outside and the faint sound of waves on the shore, and is grateful that her family has a roof overhead this night. Children, exhausted from work and play, nod off on their mats as their mother softly sings a psalm or a lullaby brought from the old country. Over in Jamestown, perhaps a group of men sit by a communal fire within the fort walls, pipes in hand, the sweet scent of tobacco smoke curling upward as they talk in low voices. They might be discussing how the stars here seem so bright and near, or reminiscing about an English summer meadow, or wondering what news the next supply ship will bring across the ocean. Among them sits one of the first African slaves, silently tending the fire, far from his homeland and unable to understand the English talk. He hums quietly an old lullaby from his village in Africa, a gentle tune that momentarily softens the hardship in his heart. A curious Englishman listens, and, not comprehending the words, still finds the melody haunting and beautiful as it mingles with the crackle of the flames. In these moments, the cruelties and sorrows of the day are temporarily at bay, and a kind of peace settles over the camp. Thus did the first footsteps of colonial America tread forward, day by difficult day. In those early decades of the 1600s, life was fragile. Entire settlements vanished or were abandoned. The infamous Lost Colony of Roanoke in the 1580s prefigured how easily an outpost could fail. Disease outbreaks could carry off half a colony in months. Conflicts with indigenous peoples flared, especially as English expansion threatened native lands. Yet, slowly, the colonies took root. Jamestown survived its starvation years and blossomed into the Virginia colony, bolstered by tobacco wealth. Plymouth, though always small, merged into the growing Massachusetts Bay Colony established by Puritans in 1630. By mid-17th century, new colonies had sprung up. Maryland to the south, a haven for Catholics; Rhode Island, founded on principles of religious tolerance; Connecticut, New Amsterdam, New York, and more. Each new colony had its own character and challenges, but all still required intense daily effort to sustain. As we move forward in our journey, we will see colonial life gradually stabilize. Communities will become more established, houses will grow sturdier and more comfortable, families will multiply, trade will connect settlements, cultures will blend and clash. The dawn will give way to the full day of colonial America. But it is worth remembering, as foundation for all that follows, those first footsteps, the courage, toil, and faith of people in the early 1600s. They laid the groundwork stone by stone, or rather log by log, meal by meal, prayer by prayer. Now, with the colonies firmly planted, let us step into a more settled scene, a day in an established colonial village, where daily life has developed its own steady rhythms and traditions. Chapter 3. A Day in a Colonial Village. New England Life. Morning comes gently to a New England village in the early 1700s. The first rays of sun stream over rolling hills dotted with stone walls and tidy fields. A rooster's crow echoes from a barnyard, and one by one, homestead doors creak open as villagers step out to greet the day. This is a well-established community now, decades or more since its founding. The village consists of perhaps 50 families. There is a cluster of weathered wooden houses around a central greensward known as the Common. Overlooking the Common stands the meeting house, its steeple modest but dignified, and nearby the little schoolhouse and the blacksmith's forge. The air is cool and fresh, scented with pine from the surrounding woods and a hint of the sea if the coast is not far off. In one farmhouse at the edge of town, a 12-year-old boy named Samuel rubs sleep from his eyes as he pulls on his coarse linen shirt and breeches. The sun is barely up, but Samuel's father has already been awake for an hour. Father had risen in the dark, as he does 6 days of the week, to tend to chores before the full workday begins. By the time Samuel comes downstairs, led by the comforting smell of breakfast, his father has milked the family cow and set 2 pails of foaming milk on the kitchen table. His mother, in her homespun apron, is frying Johnny cakes, cornmeal griddle cakes, on a cast-iron skillet over the hearth. The fire was rekindled from embers that were carefully banked overnight. For in this age, before matches, one guards a fire closely. Starting a new one with flint and steel each morning is tedious. The small kitchen is warm and smoky. Hanging from wooden pegs on the ceiling are twists of dried herbs and strings of onions. In the corner sits a big spinning wheel and basket of carded wool, reminders of the endless textile work Mother will do when time allows. But right now, she smiles at Samuel and hands him a cup of warm milk and a Johnny cake dripping with butter. The boy eats gratefully, standing at the table, for there are only a couple of chairs reserved for the adults. Often in colonial households, children stood or sat on stools at mealtime. His younger sister, still half asleep, nibbles on a crust of yesterday's bread. Father steps in from checking the henhouse, bringing a rush of crisp air. He joins them briefly to sip some hard cider. Yes, even at breakfast, a small mug of cider or beer is common. Clean water isn't always easy to obtain, and colonists believe a little fermented drink is healthful. In fact, the average colonist drinks about 3.5 gallons of alcohol per year, roughly double what Americans consume today, though mostly in the form of weak cider and ale throughout the day, rather than strong spirits. This morning's cider is tart and bracing, made from last fall's apple press. Breakfast is quick and simple. Cornmeal mush, Johnny cakes, perhaps a bit of smoked bacon from the family's hog, washed down with cider or milk. There are no imported luxuries on this table. Tea and sugar are expensive, so only occasionally does Mother sweeten the children's mush with a drizzle of honey or maple syrup instead. The family murmurs a prayer of thanks. Then it's time to work. As an old saying goes, idleness is the devil's playground, and in this village everyone, young and old, is expected to contribute. Father and Samuel head out to the fields with their ox-drawn plow. The morning light reveals their breath in the cool spring air as they coax the oxen to turn the soil for planting. The earth is rocky here in New England, and every year more stones work their way to the surface, needing to be hauled and added to the field's stone border. It's back-breaking labor, but father and son work steadily, step by step behind the plow. In time, Samuel will learn to handle the plow himself. Boys as young as early teens are often as capable as men in farm work. Across the field, they see their neighbor, Mr. Thompson, already mending a section of rail fence, while Thompson's eldest boy scatters seed for the chickens. Beyond, in the village center, a few men are gathering at the smithy. The blacksmith will shoe a horse and fix a cracked wagon wheel today. The rhythmic cling-clang of hammer on anvil starts to ring out as the smith heats and shapes iron inside the sooty forge, sending sparks flying like tiny stars. Back at the farmhouse, Samuel's mother and sister have their own full slate of tasks. First, the breakfast dishes must be cleared and cleaned. There is no running water, so little Sarah, only 8 years old, pulls on her shawl and carries a bucket to the village well. She carefully draws water and totters back with it, arms straining. Even a small child has chores that matter. By age 4 or 5, colonial children were already helping in whatever ways their small hands could manage. As one account notes, even young kids might be tasked with shelling corn, fetching wood, or scaring birds from the fields. Girls in particular learn early the arts of the household. So after Sarah returns, Mother sets her to work carding wool by the hearth, or perhaps threading a needle to practice simple sewing. Meanwhile, Mother herself churns butter in a tall wooden churn, a laborious job that can take an hour of steady plunging. Once a batch of creamy butter is done and patted into a ceramic crock, she'll move on to tending the kitchen garden. With her apron still on and a sunbonnet over her hair, she steps out to the plot behind the house where peas and beans are beginning to sprout. She carries a basket to gather any early spring greens or herbs that might enliven the supper stew. While weeding the rows, she keeps an eye on little Thomas, the toddler, who waddles nearby chasing a chicken. Mother must also watch for any signs of wild animals that might threaten her chickens or garden. A hawk circling above, or a deer sneaking in. Colonial women in such farm communities were used to working outdoors when needed. They might help plant and harvest, tend to livestock, or even take up a musket in an emergency. In New England, women bore heavy responsibilities not just in the home, but occasionally in the fields as well. As the morning progresses, the village comes alive with activity, yet it remains peaceful in its own industrious way. Smoke wafts from many chimneys now, carrying the aromas of baking bread or boiling laundry. At the edge of the common, a group of older boys is already at school, which typically begins very early. Through the open door of the one-room schoolhouse, we can hear the droning voice of the schoolmaster leading the children in reciting their alphabet from hornbooks. New England is known for valuing education. By law, towns with 50 families must have a school. The Puritan settlers believe strongly in literacy so that everyone can read the Bible. Inside, boys and girls, at least the younger ones, older girls often are kept home to help their mothers, sit on hard benches, practicing their letters on slates and reading from the New England primer. The schoolmaster might discipline a distracted pupil with a gentle rap of the ferule, pointer stick, on the desk. Outside, the spring blossoms of the maple trees begin to unfurl, and honeybees from the village hives buzz among them. A stray dog naps in the sun by the steps of the meeting house, undisturbed. The entire scene has a settled rhythm that would have been alien to the early colonists a century before. By the 1700s, A New England village like this is a well-organized little world, self-sufficient, deeply community-oriented, and bound by routines of work, faith, and mutual aid. Around midday, the church bell, which doubles as the town bell, peals to signal the dinner hour. In fields and workshops, people pause. Father and Samuel wipe sweat from their brows and lead the oxen back to the barn for a rest. They join the women and children under the shade of a big elm for their noontime dinner. In this household, dinner is the main meal of the day, and Mother has prepared a hearty stew in the big iron pot over the hearth. Within the stew simmer pieces of salt pork, some dried peas, and herbs, simple fare but filling. She ladles it into wooden bowls. The family sits on stools or stands around their rough-hewn table, which is just a board laid on trestles, as fancy furniture is scarce. They bow heads, and Father offers a blessing, gratitude for the food and for the progress of the day's work so far. They eat with pewter spoons. Forks are still uncommon in many colonial homes, so fingers and knives do the rest. The children silently enjoy the tender carrots and warm broth. For a treat, Mother has also baked an apple pie sweetened with maple sugar, a taste of the previous autumn's bounty preserved in the dried apples she stored. Pies are very common in New England cooking, used to stretch out fillings with crust. This rustic pie, served at the end of dinner, brings smiles to the faces of Samuel and little Sarah. After the meal, there might be a brief moment of rest. Father leans against the doorway, lighting his clay pipe with a coal from the fire. The fragrant tobacco smoke, locally grown or traded from Virginia, curls up as he gazes over the sunlit yard. He sees his neighbors similarly taking short respite. One sits under a tree mending a harness. Another chats with his wife by the well. Community ties are strong here. The families know one another well, having shared both celebrations and sorrows over years. They built each other's barns in raising bees and helped bring in each other's harvests. If someone falls ill or a barn burns down, the whole village rallies to help. This cooperative spirit is born of necessity and piety. In the Puritan ethic, helping one's neighbor is both godly and practical. But the break is short. Soon, all are back to work in the afternoon sun. We follow Mother and the children this time. Mother settles at her spinning wheel in a corner of the main room where light falls through the window. Her foot pumps the treadle with a soothing rhythmic motion as her fingers expertly draw out raw wool fiber, twisting it into yarn. The wheel hums softly. Spinning is nearly a daily task, making thread to later weave into cloth for the family's clothing. In colonial America, especially in rural areas, most clothing is homemade from linen, flax, or wool, since imported textiles are costly. The phrase homespun is literal here. A colonial woman might spend many hours spinning and then sewing garments for her family. While Mother spins, little Thomas has finally napped, and Sarah sits nearby stitching a sampler, a bit of embroidery young girls practice both to learn sewing and to demonstrate their letters by sewing the alphabet. Her small fingers move diligently with the needle and thread. In a corner, the family's elderly grandmother, if she's alive and present, many households include grandparents when they can, is carding more wool or shelling peas, humming a psalm tune under her breath. The room is quiet, but for the creaking of the spinning wheel and the ticking of a tall wooden clock, if the family is fortunate enough to own one. Outside, Some village women have gathered at one house to help with a particularly big chore, soap making. This messy task is best done in a group. Over an outdoor fire, a large iron cauldron bubbles with a mixture of lye and fats saved from kitchen scraps. The women take turns stirring the cauldron with a long paddle, laughing and chatting as they work. The sharp, acrid smell of lye, leached from wood ashes, mingles with the fatty odor of tallow. Soap-making day is hard work, but doing it together makes it almost a social event. Such bees, or communal work gatherings, are common. Quilting bees, apple-paring bees, barn raisings, where labor becomes a chance to socialize and bond. One woman might share news that her brother in Boston wrote a letter about ships arriving from England, or another shares a new remedy for the ague, fever, involving willow bark. They might gossip a bit about the new schoolmaster or exchange gentle jokes. The children play tag around the yard as mothers keep a peripheral eye on them. In the background, the sounds of the village continue. The thunk of an axe chopping wood, the lowing of cattle in the pasture, the distant whoosh of a mill wheel turning on the brook, if the village has a grist mill for grinding grain. As afternoon wanes, the shadows lengthen. The men finish their outdoor work. Tools are cleaned and stored, animals fed and watered. The communal well sees traffic again as people draw fresh water to carry home for the evening. In this village, as in most, there's likely a town pump or well that serves as a meeting point. It's common to see neighbors lingering by the well, exchanging polite conversation about the weather or the crops. Our friend Samuel, now done with field work, splashes his face and hands at the well trough, the cold water refreshing his sun-flushed cheeks. He's tired but proud. The south field is fully plowed and ready for planting corn tomorrow. Father pats his shoulder approvingly. Hard work is expected of everyone. Colonists often commented that in the New World, even young boys had to grow up fast and shoulder duties early. An observer might note with some surprise that colonial parents entrust even 8-year-olds with tasks like fetching water alone or using sharp tools, responsibilities modern parents might hesitate to give. But this trust is born out of necessity and a belief in teaching self-reliance early. It's said that colonial children were initiated into the adult world early, but not in a hasty or harsh manner. They were loved, but not pampered. Indeed, despite the discipline and workload, colonial parents deeply cared for their offspring, showing affection in small ways like a carved toy or a whistle given as a surprise gift when a father returned from market. One can imagine Samuel's father perhaps brought him a jackknife from town on his last trip, and Samuel treasures it greatly, using it to whittle little wood figurines in rare spare moments. Now, with dusk approaching, the village turns toward home and hearth. The sky in the west glows in streaks of pink and orange. Women who were visiting neighbors for chores gather their children and head back to their own houses, aprons filled with whatever product they made, be it newly cured soap, freshly woven cloth, or a meat pie shared by a friend. The smell of supper's cooking begins to drift through the air. One can detect the aroma of a fish chowder at the house by the river, and perhaps the spicy scent of an apple pie at another home. For supper, many families eat lightly, often leftovers from the midday dinner. In our household, Mother has kept the remainder of the noon stew warm by the fire, and now adds some dumplings to stretch it. She also slices some rye bread. Inside the dimming house, Mother lights a tallow candle or two. Candles are precious, each one hand-dipped from tallow or beeswax after much labor. But a bit of light is needed as the sun sets. The family gathers to eat. The mood at supper is generally calm and reflective. Perhaps Father asks Samuel about his thoughts on Sunday's sermon, or Mother quietly imparts a moral anecdote to the children. With bellies filled and night fallen, the family turns to evening pursuits. Around the large central hearth, truly the heart of the colonial home, the family spends their last waking hours. The hearth's warmth is welcome, as New England evenings can be cool even in spring. Firelight dances on the rough plastered walls. Father might take up a Bible or almanac to read aloud. Literacy is valued, and many New England households own at least a Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, and possibly an almanac for practical knowledge and weather-torn astrological information. This year, 1700 and something, perhaps they have a copy of Poor Richard's Almanac by a witty printer named Benjamin Franklin in far-off Philadelphia, full of wise sayings. Father's voice is steady as he reads a proverb. No gains without pains, to which Mother nods in agreement, the phrase resonating with their daily ethic of hard work. After reading, the children beg for a story. Maybe Grandmother, if present, obliges with a gentle tale from her own youth in England, or an old folk tale about fairies and farm folk, but nothing too scary, for bedtime nears. In many colonial homes, music and simple entertainment enliven the evenings. Colonists did find moments for fun amidst their labors. Here, perhaps Father takes down a fiddle from the shelf. By the flicker of fire and candle, he draws the bow across the strings, playing a slow, lilting tune remembered from long ago. Mother claps softly in time, and little Sarah sways with the melody, giggling when Father transitions into a quicker reel. In other homes, if someone has a flute or a small pump organ, music might similarly fill the night air. Singing is extremely common, psalm tunes on Sundays, but on weekdays maybe lively English or Scottish folk songs. Storytelling, too, is a favorite pastime. Adults and children alike relish tales of adventure or humor. One might tell a story of a clever fox outwitting a farmer's wife, a moral fable, or reminisce about some mischievous antics from childhood. Meanwhile, practical tasks continue. Mother might use these quiet hours to knit by the firelight, clicking her wooden needles steadily to make warm woolen socks for winter. Candle making or mending could also take place by the hearth. Colonial people were adept at mixing work with socializing. Leisure often still had a productive bent, like shelling peas while chatting or carving axe handles while listening to a story. Let us step outside the house for a moment and take in the village at nightfall. The moon rises over the common, bathing the meeting house and its surrounding graves, for most villages have a burying ground nearby, in a silvery glow. The silhouettes of homes are broken here and there by a window of light where a candle burns. Through one such window we might glimpse a family at prayers. Through another, the shadow of a woman rocking a cradle. Dogs give a few barks as someone carrying a lantern walks home from a neighbor's, but soon even the dogs curl up to sleep. The New England night is still, save for the chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl perched on the church steeple. If it's a winter night, the scene might instead include the crunch of snow underfoot and the glimmer of moonlight on the white-roofed cottages, with smoke from the chimneys standing straight up in the frosty air. But in any season, the village by night exudes a sense of order and repose. There is an unspoken security in the communal closeness of the settlement, all for one and one for all. Neighbors know that if a fire breaks out, the whole village will rush to form a bucket brigade. If illness strikes, they will help nurse each other. This shared fate builds trust. Back in our farmhouse, it is time for bed. The hour is not late by modern standards, perhaps 8 or 9 o'clock. But the colony folk keep early hours, aligning with the natural light. Early to bed and early to rise, as poor Richard would say. Father rakes the fire, carefully banking the embers so some live coals remain to restart flames in the morning. Wasting fire is risky. A cold hearth means difficulty cooking breakfast and no heat on a frigid dawn. Mother leads the children in a final prayer at bedside. They kneel on the creaking floorboards, thanking God for the day's blessings and asking protection through the night. Then the children clamber into their sleeping places. In this simple home, there are not many rooms. Often the whole family might sleep in 1 or 2 rooms. Here, perhaps an loft overhead serves as the children's bedroom. Samuel and his sister climb a ladder to a snug loft where straw-filled ticks, mattresses, await. These ticks are essentially large bags stuffed with straw or dried corn husks, maybe with a softer feather bed on top if the family can afford one. They cover themselves with quilted blankets Mother stitched over many evenings. Downstairs, Father and Mother have a curtained bedstead in the corner, a rope frame bed that sags until tightened, hence the phrase sleep tight, meaning keep your bed ropes snug. Grandmother, if with them, might sleep on a small truckle bed that slides out at night. Privacy is scant, but families are used to it. In cold weather, multiple family members even share beds for warmth. Older children together, and infants often tucked in with parents. Tonight the air is mild, and as the children lie, in the dark loft, they can see a sliver of moon through a knothole in the roof. They whisper a little before sleep. Maybe Samuel tells Sarah a quick made-up story about the family cow or the schoolmaster's wig, making her giggle. Below, Mother blows out the candle, plunging the house into darkness except for the faint orange glow of the banked hearth embers. She settles into bed next to Father, both exhausted yet content. Another day of honest labor is done. Outside, all around the village, a profound silence reigns now. The colonists sleep deeply, their bodies attuned to the farm's demands and the sun's cycle. In these pre-electric times, darkness and rest are embraced as nature's way. The only interruptions might be the periodic cries of a baby from one home, or perhaps the baying of a hound if something disturbs it. Otherwise, the New England village dreams in unison under the watch of the stars. This has been one day in one village, but it captures much of how people lived in such communities. Life is characterized by its regularity and simplicity. Work is constant, but shared among family and neighbors. Religion and morality undergird social life strongly. Virtually every activity has some ethical or spiritual dimension, whether keeping the Sabbath or raising children with strict virtues. There is little personal privacy or individualism by modern standards. Lives are very much intertwined. Yet there is comfort in that too, a sense of belonging and purpose. People are knit together as one community, as some colonial town charters described. The seasons and the sun govern the pace, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in fall, surviving through winter. In winter, especially, routines change slightly, with shorter daylight, outdoor work contracts, and indoor crafts expand. Families might spend evenings shelling nuts, mending tools, or reading by the fire while snow piles against the door. They relish seasonal treats. In autumn, fresh cider and apple butter. In spring, the first greens after a long winter of salted meat and roots. There are also occasional breaks in routine. Militia training days when the men drill with muskets on the common, children watching in awe, or election day feasts, or a visiting traveling preacher who draws folks from miles around for a multi-day revival meeting. But on most days, life in a colonial village flows gently from dawn to dusk with a reassuring sameness. Now that we have spent a peaceful day in a New England farming village, let us journey onward to explore other corners of colonial America. Not all colonists lived such a life. Many did, as the majority of colonists were farmers, and New England in particular was known for its tight-knit towns and pious routines. But to the south, in the warmer colonies, different patterns emerged. Plantations and scattered farms, a landscape where great tobacco and rice estates operated with the forced labor of enslaved Africans, and where distances between neighbors were greater. The tempo of life, the social structure, and the daily experiences there had their own character. We will next gently venture to a southern colony to glimpse a day on a Virginia plantation, a world of magnolia-scented mornings, stately manor houses, and immense fields worked from dawn to dusk by enslaved field hands. The contrast will be sharp, yet we will approach it with the same calm lens, observing how people lived, toiled, and found meaning in that very different setting. Chapter 4. Plantation Life in the Southern Colonies. Morning light filters through the Spanish moss draped on ancient oak trees in Tidewater, Virginia. The year might be around 1750. Along the gentle curves of the James River lies a vast tobacco plantation. It covers hundreds of acres of fertile, flat land, a self-contained world with its own grand house, outbuildings, slave quarters, and fields stretching as far as the eye can see. The air at dawn is thick with humidity and the promise of a warm day. A low mist rises from the river and the marshes, gradually revealing orderly rows of green tobacco plants glistening with dew. Birds are singing exuberantly in the magnolia trees. For a moment, all is quiet beauty. Then the sounds of a plantation coming to life begin. A rooster crows by the stables. The distant low of cattle drifts from the pasture, and, more sharply, a bell clangs near the slave quarters, a harsh summons that the day's labor is about to begin. In the great house, a 2-story brick mansion with white columns, the master of the plantation, Colonel William Byrd, we might imagine, is already awake. He rises from a 4-poster mahogany bed draped with mosquito netting and goes to the window. Pulling aside the heavy curtain, he surveys his domain in the golden morning light. He sees a few enslaved workers moving about near the barns, preparing the horses and wagons for the day's tasks. Satisfied that the estate is stirring properly, he rings a small handbell. In moments, a black house servant appears silently at the door with a pitcher of water. The colonel washes his face and dresses in fine attire for the day. A clean linen shirt, silk stockings, knee breeches, and a waistcoat, all tailored to his status. As he descends the grand staircase, the polished wood banister gleams. On the walls hang portraits of his ancestors and perhaps hunting scenes. Downstairs in the dining room, breakfast has been laid out. Hot coffee. The wealthy drink coffee or tea imported at dear cost. Fresh cornbread and butter, slices of ham, and some seasonal fruit preserves. The colonel's wife and children gather around the long table, all neatly dressed. His wife in a floral patterned gown and white cap. The children in miniature versions of adult clothing. The boys with little jackets, and the girls in ruffled dresses. A silver service of tea steams at one end of the table. The family murmurs a formal grace, then begins to eat. Conversation is polite and subdued. Perhaps the master discusses the expected arrival of a ship in the port of Williamsburg, carrying new goods, or the wife reminds him that a neighbor's dance, is approaching next week. A gentle clinking of china and silver accompanies their words. The food is plentiful and rich, a stark contrast to the simple fare of the New England farmers. Here on this prosperous plantation, the master's family enjoys white wheat bread, cured meats, and imported jam. The children even have sugar for their porridge, a rare commodity for most, but accessible to the elite planters who profit from the cash crops. Beyond the dining room's tall windows, one can see the broad lawn, and beyond it the slave quarters and tobacco fields. The family does not glance that way. They are accustomed to the presence of enslaved workers as an invisible supporting cast to their life. Meanwhile, in those very slave quarters, a very different morning unfolds. The bell that rang was the signal for all enslaved people to leave their cabins and report to the fields. In a small wooden cabin, 30-year-old Jacob, an enslaved field hand, quickly rises from his pallet of straw on the dirt floor. He slept in his rough clothes, a coarse linen shirt and trousers, to be ready at first light. In the dim interior of the cabin, which he shares with his wife Nansa and their 2 young children, he can barely see, but he knows every inch by touch. The cabin is tiny, maybe 12 feet by 12, made of rough planks with a crude door and one small opening that serves as a window. No glass, just a shutter. The floor is hard-packed earth. Nansa is already up, nursing the baby while also trying to spoon some cornmeal mush into the mouth of their toddling daughter. Over the hearth, a pit of ashes and a simple fireplace, a pot of cornmeal mush had cooked since before dawn. Nansa woke extra early to prepare this scant breakfast. The diet the master provides is meager, maybe a peck of cornmeal and a few salt pork scraps per week. Enslaved families have learned to supplement it however they can. A small garden patch by the cabin where Nansa grows collard greens and yams, a bit of fishing in off hours. But there is never quite enough. Jacob takes a couple of quick gulps of the bland mush from a wooden bowl. It's warm, and that's a small comfort. He gentle strokes his daughter's head, and she looks up at him with large, solemn eyes. Jacob forces a smile for her. He knows he will not see his family again until after dark. With a nod to Nansa, there's no time for lingering words. He grabs his hoe and heads out the door. His wife, after settling the children, will herself head to the fields or the big house depending on her assigned work. Today she's expected to help in the laundry boiling clothes. The baby she'll carry on her back as she works, while a slightly older child might watch the toddler. This is how enslaved mothers coped, tending children while laboring long hours. Outside, about 24 enslaved field workers gather near the shed to collect tools. The overseer, a white man hired by the master to manage the slave labor, is on horseback, already shouting orders. He carries a whip coiled at his side, a constant threat. The workers line up and then trudge to the tobacco fields in sullen silence as the sun lifts higher. It will be a brutally hot day among the broad tobacco leaves. Work begins immediately and continues relentlessly, weeding between rows, topping the tobacco plants, removing flowers to force leaf growth, or, in harvest time, cutting and hauling the heavy leaves. Life on the fields means working sunup to sundown 6 days a week. Under the sun, sweat soon soaks through their coarse garments. They labor with practiced efficiency, but often empty hearts. There is little incentive beyond avoiding the overseer's wrath. They know if they falter or slow down, a lashing could follow, as enslavers commonly enforced punishing correction. Indeed, in these colonies, enslaved people have virtually no rights or legal protections. Not long ago, it wasn't even a crime to kill an enslaved person in some places, and even by mid-century, a master who beat someone to death might get at most a light penalty. This knowledge hangs over them like a storm cloud. Yet, within themselves, they hold on to dignity and hope in quiet ways, through song, through faith, through supporting each other in adversity. As they work, one of the men starts humming a spiritual under his breath, a tune about Moses leading his people to freedom. The others recognize it and join softly, their voices harmonizing in a subdued chorus that the overseer either ignores or doesn't hear over the rustling leaves. The song gives them a rhythm and a glimmer of solace. For a moment, Jacob feels a warmth in his chest that is not from the sun. It is the warmth of community and the knowledge that though they toil in bondage, their souls remain their own. Up at the great house, the planter's family has its own daily patterns. After breakfast, the gentleman, the master, and perhaps an eldest son or a visiting neighbor might go out for a morning ride across the estate. It's part leisure, part inspection of their property. We see Colonel Bird on a fine horse, trotting along the lanes between fields, tipping his tricorn hat to the overseer in passing, and casting an eye on the progress of the tobacco crop. He might note which fields look robust, which need more labor. He is essentially supervising his human and plant property in one gaze. He might also pause by the slave quarters, not out of concern, but to count any new children, future assets in his mind, or to evaluate if repairs to the cabins are needed to keep his workforce minimally healthy. To him, enslaved people are simultaneously laborers and investments of capital. Some planters even have enslaved individuals with specialized skills, carpenters, blacksmiths, who keep the plantation running. After his ride, the colonel returns to the house where he might spend late morning in his study, writing letters or ledgers. Perhaps he writes to a London agent about the tobacco market, or reviews bills of lading for goods he's ordered. Fine fabrics, books, perhaps a new pianoforte for his daughter. Plantation owners were often also community leaders, so he might also write a note regarding the local parish church or courthouse. The planter class enjoyed a relatively leisurely pace of intellectual and social activity precisely because so much manual work was extracted from others. By mid-morning, the lady of the house, Mrs. Bird, has seen to her domestic management duties. She supervises the household slaves in their tasks, cleaning the halls, airing out bedding, sewing, tending to the kitchen garden and dairy. An enslaved cook is already toiling in the detached kitchen building to prepare the midday dinner. Mrs. Bird instructs the cook on the day's menu. Maybe fried catfish, corn pudding, and greens, plus a fruit tart for dessert. Being of the gentry, she doesn't do the heavy cooking herself, but she is expected to manage the home efficiently. She may then retire to the parlor to do fine needlework, or to teach her daughters their letters or music. Perhaps she sits at a small harpsichord with her eldest daughter, guiding her through a simple minuet, the tinkling notes floating out the open window. It is a scene of grace and cultivated ease, supported quietly by the unseen labor of many enslaved hands. By noon, the contrast in experiences on the plantation grows even starker. In the big house, the family sits down to their main meal, which they call dinner. Served in the cool, shaded dining room, they enjoy a lavish spread. Steaming platters of food are brought in by enslaved footmen. There might be roast duck, fresh vegetables from the garden, cornbread, and perhaps imported wine or locally brewed ale. The family converses about local news. The father might mention a neighbor's barn dance next Friday, or discuss an English newspaper's report on Parliament. They dine unhurried, cooled by a faint breeze through the tall French doors. After eating, they might indulge in a dessert of sweet pudding or spiced pears, and the gentleman might retire briefly for a pipe of tobacco. How ironic. They smoke the very crop that enslaved people break their backs to grow, and a glass of rum punch. The midday break offers them refreshment and sociability. In contrast, out in the fields, the enslaved laborers have no such luxury. Around noon, they pause only briefly when the overseer permits. There is no comfortable dining table under a roof for them. They crouch in the field's edge under the shade of a tree if they're lucky. Their dinner is whatever they manage to bring or is sent to them. Often, as records note, farm laborers, including enslaved workers, would have their simple midday meal brought to them in the fields. Perhaps Nansa or an older child comes carrying a bucket of corn mush or stew made from garden vegetables and scraps to distribute among the field hands. Under the broiling sun, Jacob takes a wooden ladle of the mush and eats quickly. It's bland and barely satisfying, but it keeps him going. He takes a long drink of water from a gourd canteen. The water is warm, but he's parched. He uses a rag to wipe sweat off his face, and in these few moments of pause, his mind wanders. He thinks of his wife, hoping her work in the laundry is not too arduous today, and that the baby isn't ailing. He casts a look toward the distant slave quarters. From here he can barely make out the shapes of a few cabins. They say that at some plantations, enslaved families might manage small gardens of their own or keep a chicken or two for eggs. Jacob and Nansa have done that. They have a little patch of sweet potatoes and collards. Sometimes in the evenings, after their brutally long day, they tend that garden by moonlight, because that meager produce can be the difference between enough food or going hungry. Thinking of it, Jacob allows himself a brief vision, an imagined taste of a roasted sweet potato or the sound of his daughter's laughter when they catch a hen. Such thoughts are tiny refuges that help him endure the endless afternoon ahead. Soon, the overseer's call breaks the reverie. Back to work, The sun is still high and merciless as ever. In the late afternoon, the plantation's tempo changes subtly again. The master and his family might engage in some leisure activities as the worst heat abates. Colonel Bird could ride out with his hunting hounds to flush out deer or foxes on his land, accompanied by a couple of enslaved grooms and huntsmen. Hunting is not only sport, but also provides game for the table. So we might glimpse him galloping through a wooded copse, the baying of dogs ahead as they pick up a scent, and his horn sounding a call. If a fox is caught, there may be a brief triumphant commotion, then back to the house by sundown. His wife and daughters perhaps take a stroll through the formal garden behind the great house, shaded by boxwood hedges and live oaks. They carry parasols to keep off the sun and admire the roses and jasmine that perfume the air. The littlest child chases a butterfly along the gravel path, her laughter ringing out. An enslaved nursemaid in a neat apron follows a few steps behind, keeping a watchful eye on the child. She has cared for that little girl since infancy. Often in southern households, enslaved women raised the planters' children, forming deep bonds, yet always in a subordinate role. The nursemaid gently calls the child back from straying too far. The scene is idyllic, yet underlying. It is the reality that the beautiful garden was likely laid out and maintained by enslaved gardeners, and the comfort the ladies enjoy is built on others' toil. As evening falls on the plantation, the field slaves finally trudge back from the fields. The sun sets in a blaze of orange over the river, and the air fills with the sound of cicadas. The day's work is done, at least for most. Some must still attend to livestock or grind corn into meal for tomorrow. But gradually, the enslaved community finds a few moments of their own. Back at the quarters, small cooking fires are lit outside the cabins. Nansa, having finished her long day of washing clothes under the overseer of the mistress, now cooks a meager supper for her family. In a battered pot over a fire, she might simmer some cornmeal dumplings with a handful of wild greens she gathered on the way back, or maybe okra and a scrap of pork fat, making a kind of simple stew. A precious bit of salt or pepper borrowed from the big house kitchen might season it. Other families do similarly. The quarters come alive with quiet chatter and the comforting smells of humble cooking. The men are bone-tired, their backs ache, arms are cut from tobacco leaves, and some have blistered hands. But here, away from the overseer's gaze, they can at least speak freely for a short while. They talk in low tones about their own news. Who among them is sick? Whose child learned to walk? Or perhaps whisper plans of seeking permission to visit a spouse on a nearby plantation come Sunday, the one day off. They might gossip about the master's comings and goings, or share a bit of hope or rumor, like whispers that some enslaved people found a way to buy their freedom, or that an escapee made it to the north. Such talk is dangerous, but it flickers among them because hope is as necessary as air. After supper, in one corner of the quarters, a group of the enslaved gather for a little spiritual sustenance. They sing quiet hymns or spiritual songs, clapping hands softly and swaying. They are careful not to be too loud. Official prayer meetings of slaves might be restricted, but they find ways. Perhaps old Uncle Moses, a respected elder, leads them in a prayer. In the dusk, his voice deep and gentle calls on God to give them strength, comparing their plight to the Israelites in Egypt. A chorus of amen and soft moans responds. This faith, often a blend of African traditions and Christianity learned in the colonies, is a pillar of their endurance. It provides a sense of inner freedom that no master can touch. After the prayers, a rare sound might float across the darkening yard, the soft strains of a homemade banjo or fiddle. Some enslaved Africans are skilled musicians and are sometimes even required to play music for the master's dances. But here, in their own space, the music is for themselves. A young man plucks a lively tune on the banjo, made from a gourd and animal skin. A couple of children even dance lightly, their silhouettes hopping in the firelight, bringing a smile to the faces of those who watch. For a few precious minutes, they briefly reclaim a sense of joy and humanity that the day had ground down. Up at the great house, the white family's evening is genteel and carefree. After a satisfying supper, the leftovers of which ironically helped feed the people in the quarters, the birds gather in the parlor. Candles in a brass chandelier cast a warm glow on the mahogany furniture and imported carpet. The colonel discusses the next day's plans with his eldest son. Perhaps a trip to Williamsburg, or the upcoming court day in the county. Mrs. Bird reads aloud a letter she received from her sister in England, full of news of London fashions and society. The daughters work on embroidery or play a duet on the harpsichord. In many plantation homes, evenings might also include entertaining guests, dinner parties, card games like whist, or music and dancing. Tonight, however, it's just family. The planter himself might retire to a study to write in his diary. Many did keep detailed diaries, by quill pen, recording weather, crop conditions, and perhaps a moral self-examination. Some planters saw themselves as benevolent patriarchs, guiding an agrarian utopia, oblivious to the suffering it entailed. As the hour grows late, the household slaves perform their last duties. A maid stokes the bedroom fireplaces, a butler brings a final glass of wine or closes the shutters. Then they retreat to their own cramped quarters in the attic or a back building. The Bird family members, one by one, retire to their spacious beds, resting on feather mattresses and beneath fine mosquito nets or quilts. They likely fall asleep quickly, the quiet night disturbed only by the croaking of frogs by the river and the chirp of crickets. Down in the slave quarters, Jacob and Nansa lie side by side on their pallet, their children nestled between them. The night is hot, so the cabin door is left ajar to catch any breeze. Jacob's body is exhausted, but his mind still flickers wakefully. He thinks of the days ahead, each much the same, an endless road. Perhaps he whispers to Nansa his secret thoughts. Maybe one day they could seek freedom, or at least their children might have a better fate. Nansa listens and squeezes his hand in the darkness, offering comfort. They know escape is almost impossible. Patrols and bloodhounds track runaways relentlessly, and the penalty is severe. But sometimes at night, they allow themselves to dream quietly of a different life. Above them, the southern stars twinkle through the gap in the roof. In those stars, Jacob imagines the spirit of his ancestors back in Africa, watching over him. Eventually, lulled by the chorus of nighttime insects and sheer fatigue, he drifts into a deep sleep, as do the others in the quarters. Their day, so different from the planters, finally finds a few hours of peace in oblivion. Life on a southern plantation thus unfolds in two parallel worlds, the world of the masters and the world of the enslaved. The daily routines of the master's family revolve around management, social activities, and enjoying the fruits of the plantation's output. For them, time might involve tea hours, correspondence, leisurely rides, and education for their children, often via private tutors or academies. Since plantations are far-flung, formal schools are less common than in towns. The gentlemen might have business dealings, political discussions, as many were involved in colonial government or the vestry of the church, and entertainments like hunting and horse racing. The ladies might spend afternoons visiting other plantations or hosting them, partaking in needlework, music, and household supervisory tasks. Religion is also part of their lives. On Sundays, many would dress in finery and take carriages to the local Anglican church, where they sat in family pews. Enslaved people sometimes made to sit in the back or outside. But rarely did these sermons challenge the morality of slavery. Rather, the church often reinforced the status quo. For the enslaved, the cadence of life is unceasing labor, broken only by short nights and Sundays. On Sundays, many plantation slaves were given the day off, at least in the Christian tradition, though not always in harvest season. They used this time to do their own essential work, tending personal gardens, repairing their cabins, and for worship and family, if possible. Some plantations allowed slaves to gather at a praise house or under a tree for their own church meeting. Others might use Sunday to visit family on neighboring plantations if permitted, since families were often divided by sales and marriages. These precious hours on Sunday gave a semblance of normalcy. Perhaps a father could go see a wife owned by someone else and play with his children for an afternoon before returning by curfew. However brief, such moments were vital for sustaining relationships and culture under oppression. By and large, the stark contrast between the opulence and comfort of the planters and the toil and hardship of the enslaved was a defining feature of Southern colonial life. It created a social hierarchy of extremes. The wealthy large landowners lived like an aristocracy, complete with lavish mansions, imported luxuries, and significant political power. Below them were smaller farmers, yeoman farmers, who might own a few or no slaves and worked their own modest farms. Their life was more similar to those in other colonies, a mix of hard work and simple living. And at the bottom were the enslaved Africans, as well as indentured servants, though by mid-1700s, indentured servitude was declining as racial slavery became more entrenched. Those enslaved had no freedom of movement or choice. Even after death, their burial grounds were separate and often unmarked. Their languages and cultures from Africa were suppressed, though not entirely lost. In private corners, elements of African songs, folklore, and language survived, blending into new African American traditions. For example, they told trickster tales like that of Br'er Rabbit, a clever, weak animal outwitting stronger foes, stories that gave symbolic hope, and perhaps a chuckle after a long day. Despite the brutality of the slave system, it is important to note the resilience and community bonds that enslaved people forged. In the slave quarters, they formed surrogate family ties, since blood relatives were often sold away. Fictive kin, calling unrelated elders auntie or uncle, created a supportive network. They celebrated births quietly and mourned losses together. Some plantations held covert gatherings at night known as frolics, where there might be dancing to that banjo music, signifying that even in captivity, life continued with its need for joy and human expression. The plantation microcosm is just one part of colonial America's full range, but an important one. The wealth generated by plantations, tobacco, rice, later cotton, would shape not only the southern colonies, but the economy of all the colonies, and even England. Yet while we often hear about the grand historical forces, it is through this calm observation of daily life, the breakfast tables, the field songs, the evening prayers, that we truly understand how people actually lived. Now, with the sun set on our southern day, we will turn to some other perspectives that complete the picture. Our next chapter will shift focus to the lives of those who are often less documented in traditional histories, the women and children of colonial America across the regions, and also the experiences of free poor families, servants, and others. As always, we will do so in a gentle, reflective tone, as if listening to a bedtime story of history. Chapter 5: Women and Domestic Life in the Colonies. In a modest clapboard house in a colonial town, a candle burns late into the night. It illuminates a woman's tired but determined face as she rocks a cradle with one hand and darns a sock with the other. This is Elizabeth, a tailor's wife in a New England coastal town, circa 1740. Her day, like that of most colonial women, has been long and filled with unending tasks. Now, in the quiet of midnight, she finally has a few moments to herself, if tending an awake infant can be called to herself. The baby fusses softly, and she gently hums a lullaby, an old tune her mother sang to her, to soothe the child back to sleep. The household around her is dark. Her husband and older children have been asleep for hours, exhausted by their own work. Only Elizabeth carries on, eyes heavy, patching a hole in her son's only pair of wool stockings by flickering candle. The scene is humble, but within it lies the heart of colonial domestic life. Women were the backbone of home and family, their labor largely unsung, yet absolutely essential. Let us walk through a day in the life of a typical colonial woman like Elizabeth, understanding her world, her burdens, and her quiet strength. The rooster's crow at dawn usually finds Elizabeth already awake. Perhaps the baby stirred before first light, needing feeding, or maybe Elizabeth rose proactively to get a start at the breakfast. Either way, sleep has been short. She wraps a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill and stirs up the kitchen hearth's embers to restart the fire. Soon, the smell of wood smoke and brewing porridge fills the small house. Women customarily rose before everyone else to prepare the first meal. Elizabeth moves efficiently, adding water and a scoop of cornmeal to the iron pot, placing it over the flame. She then tiptoes out to the chicken coop behind the house to collect eggs. The dawn light reveals a garden that she tends, showing new leaves on the cabbages and herbs. A neighbor's cat slinks by, and Elizabeth shoos it away from the coop. Back inside, she hears her toddler son calling groggily for her. Balancing a basket of eggs, she scoops him up and kisses his cheek. Soon the others rise, her husband John, who has a long day ahead in his tailor shop, and their two older girls who will attend to chores and perhaps a bit of schooling if it's a day for the dame school. They gather around the table, a rough plank lit by the gray morning through the window. Elizabeth ladles the warm corn porridge into wooden bowls and cracks a couple of eggs to fry on the skillet for John. He needs the extra strength for his work, she thinks. She slices yesterday's bread to serve alongside. As they eat, she reminds her daughters to fetch water from the well afterwards and to help mind their little brother. There's no idle chatter of, "How did you sleep?" or leisurely sipping of tea. Tea is expensive, and only perhaps on Sunday would they treat themselves to that. Instead, conversation revolves around the tasks of the day. John mentions a customer coming for a fitting. Elizabeth states she needs to wash laundry today since the weather will be clear. After breakfast, the family scatters to their duties. John walks to his shop on the main street. The older girls put on aprons and start sweeping the hearth and floor. And Elizabeth ties her linen cap firmly over her hair, rolls up her sleeves, and heads to the yard with a basket of linen for washing. Wash day is a major undertaking, often done weekly or bi-weekly. She fills a large kettle at the well and hoists it onto the outdoor fire pit. As the water heats, she sorts the soiled shirts, shifts, and linens. She's made her own lye soap, a harsh cleanser, and once the water is near boiling, she soaks and scrubs each garment on a wooden washboard or stomps them in a barrel. Her hands turn red and raw from the hot water and lye. It's heavy labor, lifting wet sheets, wringing water out by twisting them with a stout rod. Wringer devices are not common yet. She might rope in her older girls to help rinse or wring. Eventually, the clean, or at least cleaner, laundry is hung on lines or spread on bushes to dry in the sun. By now, Elizabeth's back aches and her clothes are sweat-soaked, but there's no pause. While the laundry dries, she moves on to the next chore, kneading dough for bread. Earlier, before washing, she set up a sponge, yeast mixture for bread. Now she adds flour and salt and works the dough vigorously on the kitchen table, her forearms straining. Once kneaded, the dough will rise for a while. That grants her a short window to catch up on mending. Sitting by the window with a needle and thread, she patches a tear in her husband's work trousers and sews a missing button on a child's dress. As she sews, she keeps a vigilant eye on her toddler playing on the floor with wooden blocks. Perhaps simultaneously, she stirs a cooling pot of soup that will be dinner, ensuring it doesn't stick to the pot. Colonial women famously multitasked before the term existed, balancing childcare, cooking, and crafts all at once. As one source notes, their daily routine included cooking, cleaning, sewing, washing clothes, making candles, and caring for children. Even the youngest children had chores. Every extra set of hands mattered. Around midday, the household reconvenes for dinner, the noon meal. Elizabeth's bread is now baked to a golden crust in the brick oven beside the hearth. She has churned butter earlier in the week, a laborious task itself, pumping a churn for an hour. So fresh butter and bread are on the table. The stew she simmered, made of beans, a bit of salt pork, and garden herbs, is ladled out. The family bows their heads and thanks Providence for the meal. Elizabeth eats quickly, already mentally cataloging the afternoon's duties. She might need to finish ironing some clothes now that they're dry. Ironing means heating heavy irons on the fire and pressing linen on a sturdy table. Or maybe she has to tend the garden, weeding and picking some early beans. If it's summer, she could have fruit to preserve or pickle. Colonial women were adept at preserving food for winter, from drying apples to making pickled cucumbers and spiced peaches. It's said colonists loved pickling so much They would even pickle watermelon rinds or wildflowers. The smell of vinegar might often waft through the kitchen in pickling season. If it's autumn, she's busy boiling down apples into apple butter or threading apple slices to hang and dry. Every season has its labors, and women's chores changed with them. Aside from manual tasks, Elizabeth also tends to the moral and educational upbringing of her children. After dinner, perhaps she instructs her daughters in some reading or needlework. In many colonies, especially New England, mothers were often the primary educators at home, teaching children to read the Bible and basic letters. If she's literate, likely given her town setting and Puritan influence, she'll guide them through a hornbook or primer. One child recites, "In Adam's fall we sinned all," from the New England primer, while Elizabeth corrects softly. She likely emphasizes scripture and catechism, aligning with the community's values. Meanwhile, she might also impart practical skills, showing her daughter how to card wool or how to safely tend the hearth. Girls learned by watching and doing alongside their mothers, preparing for their own domestic futures. By age 4 or 5, a girl might already know how to help with cooking and cleaning. A common saying was that by the time a girl was able to reach the latch of the door, she was old enough to help around the house. Boys, in turn, learned from fathers or by apprenticeship. But when young, they too fell under mother's supervision and were given tasks like collecting firewood, feeding animals, or simple field chores appropriate to their age. For many women, their identity and legal existence were tied to their husbands once married. Under the doctrine of coverture in English law, a married woman could not own property or sign contracts independently. Her legal rights were subsumed under her husband's. Elizabeth knows that if anything happened to John, her situation would be precarious, perhaps reliant on adult sons or kin to manage property. This knowledge imparts a certain humility and mutual dependence in their marriage. That said, within the home, a capable wife often exercised considerable managerial power. She ran the household economy. She decided how to conserve food, how to budget household goods, and often engaged in minor trade like selling excess eggs or cheese for pin money. In towns, some women ran inns or shops, especially widows, or in the absence of a husband. But legally and socially, women were expected to be the weaker vessel, focused on home and children. That doesn't mean women were idle or purely domestic in a narrow sense. On farms, women regularly helped with agriculture, milking cows, collecting sap for maple sugar, planting and harvesting kitchen gardens, and even helping with plowing or field harvests if needed. An observer in Virginia noted women foraged for additional food, built homes, made pottery, mats, baskets, household furnishings, and farmed alongside men. This description was of indigenous women, but colonial farm wives, too, had similar broad roles, albeit within their cultural context. In frontier areas, a woman might be called upon to do traditionally male tasks like shooting game or defending the homestead in an emergency. Strength and resilience were essential. It was often remarked that colonial women, especially on the frontier, were rarely overweight and often aged prematurely from hard work and frequent childbearing. Indeed, by age 50, many were described as worn out if they even lived that long. Childbearing itself was a central part of women's lives. Marriages were early, late teens or early 20s typical, and fertility was high. It was common for a woman to bear 6, 8, 10, or more children over her lifetime. But not all would survive. Child mortality was tragically common. A mother could expect perhaps only half her children to live past infancy in some regions. Each pregnancy also put the mother's life at risk. There were no doctors, as we know, only midwives and home remedies for the dangerous business of childbirth. Fevers and complications could easily be fatal. Consequently, women lived under the constant shadow of mortality. Abigail Adams, in one of her letters, noted how so many women and babies were lost that it was the great scourge of their sex. Despite these hardships, women pressed on, raising large families because they had to. In a labor-scarce agricultural society, many hands were needed, and also the expectation that not all children would reach adulthood meant having more to ensure some survived. In Elizabeth's town, she has perhaps a few women friends or relatives who support each other, especially during childbirth or sickness. The social world of women often revolved around communal activities, midwives assisting labor, neighbor women bringing food to a new mother's home, or gatherings for quilting and sewing where they could chat and bond. These frolics, or bees, provided rare moments of relative relaxation and the airing of news or gossip. Maybe once a week, Elizabeth might visit the neighbor for an hour, bringing her baby along to exchange a new recipe or to borrow a tool. Church on Sunday is another key outlet. After services, women linger outside to ask after each other's families. In certain regions, particularly Quaker communities in the middle colonies or among Moravians or other sects, women had slightly more public voice and might even preach or hold separate women's meetings. But in Ida, Puritan and Anglican settings, they were largely quiet participants, though behind the scenes they ran the vital networks of charity, cooking for the poor or nursing the ill. As evening falls, Elizabeth's tasks continue. There's supper to prepare, usually lighter than dinner, often leftovers or a simple pottage. She perhaps reheats the noon stew and slices more bread. The family eats by candlelight or firelight. Her husband is tired from hours bent over tailoring work. Her daughters are sleepy from early rising. But there are still chores. The milking must be done again. Cows are milked morning and evening. The chickens secured. Perhaps water drawn for washing faces before bed. Elizabeth ensures every child's face and hands are washed, a cleanliness habit Puritans encouraged next to godliness. If any child is ill, and often some sniffle or fever goes around, she tends them with an herbal brew, maybe willow bark tea for a fever or mint for a stomachache. These remedies she learned from her mother or a neighbor, as formal medicine is almost non-existent. Women were the healers in many homes, knowing how to make poultices, teas, and other cures from local plants. By night, after the children are put to bed, perhaps all in one room or loft, sharing beds to keep warm, Elizabeth finally sits down with her husband by the hearth. This might be their only quiet moment together all day. John might read aloud from the Bible or from an almanac by flickering firelight. She listens while darning socks or knitting, always something in her hands. They share a few reflections about the day. Perhaps John mentions a bit of town news, a ship arrived from England with goods, or talk of rising taxes by the crown, or a neighbor's barn accident. Elizabeth might softly bring up that their eldest daughter is nearing marriageable age, or that they need a new iron pot as the old one is cracking. These small conversations reinforce their partnership. Colonial couples often had pragmatic bonds. Romance, as we conceive it, was secondary to survival and cooperation. Yet many letters and diaries show genuine affection and respect growing from facing life's trials together. John relies on Elizabeth immensely, and he knows it. In fact, when he travels, say to a market or to handle business, he leaves the entire homestead in her capable hands, trusting her to manage money, direct any apprentices or servants, if they have, though a humble tailor might not, and keep everything running. Many women proved adept at such management. Some even ran family businesses if widowed or if husbands were away. For instance, there are records of women tavern keepers, printers. Ben Franklin's wife Deborah ran his printing shop while he was abroad, and plantation managers if the master was absent. So while legally constrained, in practice, colonial women often exercised significant agency within their sphere. Before going to sleep, the family gathers for a brief devotion. This might mean singing a psalm or saying a prayer together. In Puritan practice, families often did evening exercise, which included scripture reading and prayer. Elizabeth's children cluster around as John reads a comforting passage by candlelight. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." It feels personal. They certainly labored and are laden with cares. After the almonds, they all retire. Elizabeth settles the baby in a cradle near her bed, so she can attend quickly if it wakes. She curls up next to her snoring husband, the darkness finally closing in. Her body is sore, but she utters a final silent prayer of thanks that they got through another day with no disaster, that her family is fed and safe. She prays for strength to do it all again tomorrow. And indeed, tomorrow it will begin anew. Pre-dawn fire stoking, children to feed, bread to bake, clothes to sew, water to haul. The routine can seem endless and monotonous, but within it, life's meaning unfolds. Raising her children, keeping her household, loving her family and honoring God through her service. In that, she finds a quiet dignity. Not all women's lives were identical, of course. There were variations by region and class. A wealthy planter's wife in the South had enslaved servants to do much of the drudgery, freeing her to focus on overseeing rather than directly scrubbing and cooking. She might spend more time on fine needlework, letter writing, or social calls. But she also faced the pressures of managing a large estate's domestic side, inventories of linens, planning large meals, hosting frequent guests, and often acting as amateur nurse or midwife to those on the plantation, enslaved and free alike. Southern mistresses often had complicated, sometimes tragic roles regarding enslaved women. On one hand, expected to care for them in illness or childbirth, because the master often would not, on the other hand, complicit in their oppression. Meanwhile, frontier women led more rugged lives, sometimes working the fields with their husbands, defending the home during conflicts, and enduring extreme isolation. Abigail Gardner, a frontier wife, wrote of not seeing another woman for months at a time in the wilds, which weighed on her mental health. In cities like Boston or Philadelphia, some women engaged in trade, selling butter or cloth in markets. Others took in boarders for income or did spinning, quartz weaving for hire. Colonial gig economy, if you will. If unmarried, a woman might work as a servant in a wealthier household or as a governess or midwife. Midwifery was one respected female profession. Midwives like Martha Ballard, made famous in her diary, delivered hundreds of babies and were pillars of their communities. Women also formed the majority in certain religious movements, like the early converts and the Great Awakening revivals of the 1740s were often young women. Yet, ironically, those institutions rarely let them lead. An exception, the Quakers allowed women to speak in meeting and be public friends, preachers, and gave equal spiritual weight to women's meetings. In those circles, a woman like Elizabeth might have more voice, but mainstream colonial culture generally taught female submissiveness. Manuals and sermons extolled the virtues of the good wife, obedient, chaste, silent in public, industrious at home. Court records show women could be punished for speaking out. For example, a scold's bridle or dunking was sometimes used on a woman deemed a scold, too nagging or outspoken. The notorious Salem witch trials of 1692 disproportionately targeted women, often those who were older, widowed, or socially awkward, reflecting community anxieties about women who didn't fit the norm. Despite these strictures, colonial women wielded subtle power within their domain. They influenced the values and habits of the next generation through child rearing. They could shape their marriages. An understanding husband might yield to his wife's counsel in private, even if publicly men had final say. We have evidence of strong personalities. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband, John Adams, in 1776, advising him to remember the ladies in the new laws of the land, warning jocularly that if women were not given a voice, they might foment a rebellion. Her letters show she was an intellectual equal to John in many ways. While her advice was not heeded in law, women's suffrage was far off. It highlights that women were politically aware and had their own opinions on liberty and rights. Some women in the Revolutionary era even engaged in boycotts of British goods, spinning their own cloth to support the patriot cause, the Daughters of Liberty. But that is just on the horizon of our colonial time frame. For now, in the mid-18th century, the everyday life of women like Elizabeth continues mostly unchanged, as it had for generations, anchored in home, family, and community. The calm scene of Elizabeth singing her baby to sleep encapsulates it. Amidst endless work, moments of tenderness and love are what give it purpose. She may not appear in history books, but women like her are the reason families survived the harsh winters, why children grew up with morals and skills, why communities held together. They were, in essence, the quiet heroines of colonial America. Having spent time appreciating the life of colonial women, we turn our attention next to the children, how they grew, learned, and played in this era. Childhood in colonial times was in some ways brief and in other ways quite different from today. We will see how children were expected to contribute early to the family, yet still found ways to be children with games and mischief. And we will peek into the one-room schoolhouses and apprenticeships that shaped their futures. In doing so, we'll continue our calm, thoughtful exploration of the full range of colonial society. Chapter 6: Childhood and Education in the Colonies. In the soft light of an early summer morning, a young boy named Peter stands outside a farmhouse, barefoot in the dewy grass, flinging stones at an old tree stump pretending it's a deer in the forest. He is 7 years old, freckle-faced, and full of imagination. For a brief moment, he is just a child at play, no different in spirit from a child today. But soon a call comes from the house, his mother's voice reminding him to fetch water from the brook and then help feed the chickens. Peter's day, like that of most colonial children, will quickly transition from play to work. In colonial America, childhood was a time of learning and growth, but it was often much shorter and more laborious than we consider normal now. Children were cherished by their parents, to be sure, but they were also expected to contribute early to the family's survival and to be miniature adults in training. The concept of coddled, carefree childhood was limited. Instead, by the time they could walk steadily, boys and girls had small jobs to do. Let us follow a day in the life of colonial children like Peter and his sister Mary, and see how they learned, played, and gradually took on the roles of adults. Peter returns to the house, muscles straining as he carries a wooden bucket brimming with fresh water. He's careful not to spill too much. Water is heavy and each trip to the brook takes time. At the kitchen door, his mother ruffles his hair approvingly and takes the bucket. Inside, 5-year-old Mary is helping Mother by using a big spoon to stir the porridge pot, with supervision, as the hearth is dangerous. Mary feels proud to be allowed to do this big girl task. Colonial parents assigned chores to children at very young ages, partly to teach responsibility, and partly because every hand was needed. Girls might start around 4 or 5, with simple tasks like minding a baby sibling, fetching kindling, or carding wool. Boys of 6 or 7 might herd chickens, carry messages, or begin learning to chop lightwood. It's said that by age 8, colonial boys might be trusted to fetch water or even use a small gun to hunt squirrels. And indeed, some accounts mention lads left unsupervised with firearms to guard fields from birds. Our friend Peter has not yet handled a gun, but he does follow his father sometimes to check the traps in the woods for rabbits. He dreams of the day when he will be allowed to hunt a deer like a real man. Mary, on the other hand, has a small doll carved from corn husk that she adores. She only plays with it after supper, as during the day she shadows her mother or older sisters, imitating their chores. Through play such as playing house, she is actually practicing future skills, rocking her corn husk doll to sleep as she has seen her mother rock the baby. Cooking pretend meals of mud and flowers in little pots. In colonial times, children's play often mimicked adult life, preparing them for their roles. After Saiktu, breakfast, the structured part of the children's day, begins. School. In many New England towns by the 18th century, there's a schoolhouse, or at least a schoolmaster who holds class in a spare room of the meeting house or his own home. Peter, at age 7, is enrolled in the village school. Mary, at 5, might not be in formal schooling yet. Often schooling started around 6 or 7. But their parents strongly believe in literacy, mainly so that they can read the Bible. So they have already taught Mary her ABCs at home. Now Peter and a cluster of neighbor children walk to the schoolhouse down the lane. It's a small timber building with a single room. Inside, about 20 children ranging from 6 to 12 years old sit on wooden benches. The schoolmaster is a stern man with a wig slightly askew and spectacles perched on his nose. A switch, rod, rests by his desk, a silent warning to behave. They begin with a prayer, then recitation of the alphabet. Young Peter holds a horn book, a paddle with a printed sheet of alphabet, and the Lord's Prayer covered by a transparent sheet of horn. He and the other little ones chant A, B, C. Meanwhile, older students read from primers or write sums on slate boards. The room hums with murmured lessons. Discipline is strict. If a child fidgets or whispers out of turn, the master might rap the desk sharply, or in worse cases apply the birch rod to a disobedient behind. Corporal punishment was an accepted part of schooling then. But mostly, the children are used to order. They know they'll be quizzed on their catechism and spelling and must respond loudly and clearly. New England law actually required that children be taught to read so they would not be ignorant of the scriptures. Illiteracy was seen as both a personal and social failing. By one estimate, female literacy in New England was around 62%, with male higher. Not bad for the time, while in some other colonies it was lower, e.g., female literacy in 18th century Virginia was perhaps under 30%. This shows the regional variation. Puritan influence made education a priority. In contrast, in the rural South, schooling was often done at home by tutors for the rich, or not at all for poorer farming families. Sons of planters might be sent to England for higher studies, while daughters were taught mainly accomplishments and basic reading at home. Middle colonies, being diverse, had church-run schools, like Quaker schools, Dutch parochial schools, etc., and apprenticeships. Overall, formal education beyond basic literacy was more common for boys. Girls often learned reading, so they could read the Bible, but not always writing, based on the notion that a wife needed to read but had little cause to write or do math. A prejudice reflected in literacy rates like 70% female illiteracy in colonial Virginia. But in practice, many girls in New England did learn to write too, often from their family, if not school. Peter's school day might last only a few hours in the morning. Some schools ran all day with a break, others a half day, because children were often needed at home for chores. Today, let's say he's excused by noon to help his father in the fields, common in planting or harvest season. He learned a bit of spelling, copying the words cat, dog, cow on a slate, and recited the line from the New England Primer. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. That primer page with rhyming couplets for each letter is etched in his mind, partly because it's one of the few books he sees besides the Bible. Books are scarce. Maybe the school has a few readers like Pilgrim's Progress or Histories, but that's it. So education relies a lot on rote memory and recitation. The children memorize poems, Bible verses, and math tables. Writing is practiced with quill and homemade ink on paper, which is precious, or more commonly with chalk on slate that can be erased and reused. For math, the master might set practical problems, measuring fencing needed for a field or calculating change for a pound currency, skills useful for trade and farming. Science or geography are rarely taught beyond maybe basic astronomy, for navigation, or local geography. However, some brighter or wealthier boys might eventually learn a bit of Latin or higher math if preparing for college, Harvard, Yale, etc., which were primarily divinity schools at the time. But those are the minority. While Peter is at school, Mary remains home, following her mother around like a little shadow. She might play a bit. Maybe her mother lets her take her corn husk doll and play under a tree while mother churns butter. Perhaps neighbor children come to play too. Little girls might play house or with dolls. Little boys play soldier or practice target throwing. Toys are mostly homemade. rag dolls, carved animals, spinning tops. A popular game for both genders is rolling a hoop with a stick. Older siblings might involve younger in more active play like races or climbing trees. There's also a colonial game of 9 pins, bowling, or quoits. Ring toss, they might imitate. But free time for play isn't abundant except for the youngest. When Peter returns from school, he changes into work clothes, which might just be the same clothes, honestly. Colonial children often just had 1 or 2 sets of garments. His father takes him to the field to help pick rocks or scare crows, or maybe to the barn to learn how to groom the horse. Colonial boys were expected to gradually learn their father's trade or farming techniques. Around age 12 or 13, many boys would enter an apprenticeship, either with their own father or sent to another craftsman to learn a trade like blacksmithing, carpentry, sailing, or shopkeeping. During apprenticeship, which could last until age 21, they essentially lived with the master and worked in exchange for training. It was a form of education and labor combined. For example, a printer's apprentice might spend long hours setting type and running the press, but in return, learn to read well and manage a business. Girls, on the other hand, were apprenticed in domestic arts under their mothers at home. Some girls in towns might be sent to live with another household to learn specialized skills like cheese-making or fine sewing, and perhaps to find a husband eventually. But formal apprenticeships for girls were rare, except sometimes for orphaned or poor girls, who might be placed as servants until adulthood. The family also imparts moral and religious education continuously. The children are taught to say prayers at meals and bedtime. They are corrected for fibs or laziness promptly, a common maxim from Scripture. Spare the rod and spoil the child, meaning discipline is seen as love. That doesn't necessarily mean all parents beat their kids harshly, but a quick swat or stern lecture was normal. Puritan diaries often mention concerns about children's souls and urging them toward piety early. For instance, Cotton Mather wrote instructions on how to catechize children from toddler age. Sabbath day is a trial for youngsters. They must sit through long church sermons quietly. Woe betide the child who giggles or fidgets too much on the pew. A parent might pinch their ear, or an usher might even tap them with a long pole. Some church wardens carried poles, one end to poke sleepers, one end with a soft bit to gently wake dozing women. Yet, Sunday might also be a break from hard labor, though not for mothers who still cook. The afternoon after church, children perhaps quietly read or recite Bible verses. Some colonial diaries mention children walking to a neighbor's house on Sunday evening to recite catechism answers to a respected elder, a sort of religious schooling. Despite strict upbringings, children did find joy and have fun in their own ways. They loved stories. In the evenings by the hearth, after lessons or chores, they'd beg for a tale. Parents or grandparents might tell Bible stories, or perhaps an English fairy tale like Jack and the Beanstalk. Many traditional tales were known then, too, or folklore about local happenings. Maybe a ghost story or a cautionary tale about a child who wandered into the woods and met trouble. These tales, told in a soft voice by firelight, surely gave the children thrills and spark for their imaginations, though official Puritan stance frowned on vain fables. Informally, many families still passed on such folklore. In more diverse colonies, children heard a mix. German fables in Pennsylvania Dutch country, African stories like Anansi the spider among enslaved communities. Enslaved children grew up hearing rich oral traditions, which sometimes spread beyond their own group when interacting. On winter nights, after supper, children might play quiet indoor games, maybe fox and geese, a board game similar to checkers, drawn on a slate. Or do riddles. Tongue twisters and riddles were a common parlor amusement. As children grew into adolescence, which term didn't exist, they were either children or young adults, they took on more serious work. A boy of 14 in a farm might plow solo, handle a musket for hunting, or drive a wagon to town. A girl of 14 might practically run the household if the mother was ill or busy, including cooking entire meals, brewing beer. Women brewed small beer at home as a staple beverage, weaving cloth, etc. Youth also started courtship early, not as early as 14 usually, but by 16-17 boys might eye girls, especially in less strict communities. In Puritan areas, premarital social mixing was carefully watched. No dancing, often group activities like husking bees where one could slyly flirt under supervision. But in other places, there were dances, sleigh rides, or church events where young people mingled. Many women married by 18 to 20, men a bit later on average, mid-20s, especially if they had to finish apprenticeship or get land. Education beyond basic level was rare for most. However, for those destined for leadership, around age 15-16, some boys went to college. Harvard was only for male at that time. There they would study advanced Latin, Greek, theology, law, etc. But these were a tiny fraction, maybe a few hundred in the whole population at mid-century. For most children, schooling ended in their early teens, when work took over full time. Let's return to Peter and Mary in the early evening. As the sun sets, Peter sits whittling a stick into a slingshot under the porch, while Mary hums a song to her dolly. Their father joins Peter and shows him how to aim the slingshot safely, maybe even reminisces about when he was a boy and used one to chase crows. Inside, the smell of pumpkin and corn stew wafts. Their mother is finishing supper. Once they eat and do the evening routine of washing up, the family gathers near the hearth. Peter is practicing writing letters on his slate by firelight. He slowly draws A, B, C, and his mother praises his neatness. Mary is too little to write, but she sits on her father's knee as he reads a short passage from the family Bible, the story of young Samuel hearing God's voice at night, which Peter finds relatable. A child being chosen. How special. After prayers, Mother takes Mary to bed, tucking her into a trundle bed that slides under the parents' bed. Mary asks, "Mama, will you tell me the rhyme about the star?" And Mother obliges softly, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Yes, that classic existed by late 18th century, though in different wording originally. Mary's eyelids soon droop. Peter, being a bit older, stays up a little longer. He dawdles, brushing his feet off. No shoes worn indoors. Father reminds him to say his own bedtime prayer. Peter kneels and says, "Now I lay me down to sleep." A common children's prayer, then as now. With a good night kiss, he climbs up the ladder to the loft, where he and his older brother sleep on a straw mattress. The loft has small window holes. Through one, Peter sees the summer stars glittering. He remembers the star rhyme and smiles, then drifts off, hugging a stuffed cloth he uses as pillow. In their dreams, colonial children probably mixed everyday scenes with flights of fancy, just as children do now. Maybe Peter dreams of being a hero saving the town from wolves, or Mary of a magical talking cat from a story she heard. By the first light of dawn, they'll awaken and their cycle starts anew. Chores, learning, play. They are being quietly molded into the adults they will soon become. But in these early years, they still know the simple joys of childhood, racing a friend down a path, playing tag around the haystacks, or being comforted on a lap while listening to a soothing lullaby. Childhood in the colonies was certainly more constrained and work-filled than modern childhood, but it was not without love, laughter, and learning. Parents sacrificed much for their kids, hoping they'd have a better life, or at least carry on the family name and trade. The community also invested in children, seeing them as the next generation of godly society. Especially in Puritan view, much energy was put into ensuring children didn't stray into sin. Sometimes, though, adolescent rebellion did occur. Diaries mention youths getting into mischief like skipping church to go fishing, or playing tricks on neighbors, or in one case in Massachusetts, teenage boys stealing fruit from an orchard and getting hauled to court for it. They were punished usually with a fine or public admonition, since youth was seen as folly-prone. But by and large, children were expected to put away childish things early and assume adult responsibilities soon. As we consider colonial life comprehensively, we have now seen it through the eyes of farmers, planters, women, enslaved individuals, and children. We've peeked into homesteads and fields, schoolrooms and workshops. To complete our journey, perhaps we should cast a glance at colonial cities and towns, how life in a bustling port like Philadelphia or Boston differed from the farm and frontier, and at the interactions between all these groups, how trade knit them together, how events like market days or militia musters brought society into contact. We will also reflect on the indigenous peoples again in their relation with colonial children. Some colonial children grew up alongside native children in certain areas, or at least saw them in towns trading. Each perspective enriches the mosaic of everyday life. Before we conclude, let's indulge in one more gentle scene to tie it together. Imagine a summer fair day in a colonial town. Families from miles around come by wagon or on foot to the town green. There are stalls with fresh berries, folks selling gingerbread cakes, a fiddler playing a jig on the corner, children chasing each other in excitement while parents bargain for a new iron pot or some imported sugar. An indigenous man from a nearby tribe might be there selling baskets, conversing with townsfolk in broken English, while an enslaved African woman stands by her mistress's side, quietly watching the merriment, but not quite part of it. It's a rare treat for all, a break from routine to experience community cheer. As twilight falls, people gather their goods and head home, lanterns swinging from wagons, children dozing off in laps. These communal gatherings gave some relief from the grind of life and reminded colonists that they were part of a larger human tapestry, sharing stories and culture. In our next and final portion, we shall take that broader look at community and the connections between these varied lives, and then gently close the chapter on colonial America with a reflection of how this way of life would soon transform with the coming of a new nation. But for now, let us leave Peter and Mary sleeping soundly knowing that in them lies the hope and continuation of the colonial story into the future.